The old brick building on Willow Street stood like a sentinel of sorrow. Its windows, dark and watchful, seemed to harbor secrets within their panes. For years, tenants spoke in hushed tones about the mournful cries that echoed through the halls at night, always seeming to originate from the abandoned well in the courtyard. Dr. Theodore Baldwin, a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma, moved into apartment 4B with more than just her luggage. She carried the weight of her own grief, a failed marriage, a miscarriage, and a growing sense that her life had veered off course. The cheap rent was a blessing for her dwindling bank account, but the atmosphere of the building immediately set her on edge. It didn't take long for Sarah to notice the haunted looks in her neighbor's eyes. Mrs. Patel from 2A confessed to waking up in tears every morning. Young Tim in 5C admitted he'd started drinking again after years of sobriety. Even the usually cheerful super, Mr. Guzman, seemed to move through the halls like a man carrying an invisible burden. One sleepless night, driven by the sound of distant weeping, Theodore ventured into the building's musty basement. Amidst cobwebs and forgotten relics, she discovered a box of old newspapers. The yellowed pages told the story of Maria Delgado, a young mother who lost her son to polio in 1963. Consumed by grief, Maria drowned herself in the courtyard well just days later. As Theodore delved deeper into the building's history, she began to experience vivid, heart-wrenching dreams. In them, she found herself by the well, but when she looked into the water, it wasn't her reflection staring back. It was Maria's face, contorted in anguish. Theodore would wake gasping, her pillow wet with tears she didn't remember crying. Driven by both professional curiosity and a growing sense of urgency, Theodore started informal group therapy sessions in the building's common room. At first, her neighbors were hesitant, but as they began to share their experiences, a pattern emerged. Everyone had been dreaming of Maria, but each saw her differently, always as a reflection of their own deepest fears and regrets. Theodore's breakthrough came when she realized the haunting wasn't supernatural at all. The building, with its tragic history, had become a focal point for the residents' collective trauma and unprocessed grief. Maria's story resonated with their own pain, creating a shared delusion that manifested in their dreams and emotions. As the group sessions continued, something remarkable happened. The residents began to heal, not just from their current distress, but from old wounds they'd carried for years. Mrs. Patel finally mourned the son she'd lost in India decades ago. Tim found the strength to confront the childhood abuse he'd tried to drown in alcohol. Mr. Guzman spoke about the guilt he'd carried since surviving a car crash that killed his brother. Theodore, too, found herself opening up about her own losses. In helping her neighbors, she began to heal herself. The nightly weeping faded, replaced by the sounds of laughter and conversation as the residents forged genuine connections. On the anniversary of Maria's death, the tenants gathered around the old well. Instead of fear, there was a sense of reverence. They shared stories, not just of Maria, but of all the loved ones they'd lost. As the sun set, Theodore could have sworn she saw a woman in a vintage dress standing at the edge of the group, smiling peacefully before fading into the twilight. The Willow Street apartments were never truly cursed. They were a crucible, where shared pain could either destroy or transform. Through compassion and understanding, the residents had turned a place of sorrow into one of healing and hope. Theodore stayed on, continuing her work with the community. She learned that sometimes the most haunted places are the chambers of our own hearts, and that the most powerful exorcism is the simple act of being heard and understood. The first time Mira saw the shadow, she thought it was some trick of light on steam. As days passed, the figure grew bolder, its outline sharpening against the pale tiles of her shower. It seemed to be searching, its ethereal hands probing the grout lines with ghostly fingers. Mira wasn't the only one. Whispers spread like mold through the pipes in Riverview Apartments. Mrs. Abernathy, 3B, swore she'd seen it reaching for her shampoo bottle. The college kids in 5A laughed about their new bathroom buddy. But beneath the nervous laughter flowed the pulse of unease. The chill of autumn brought a team of paranormal investigators who slipped into the building, invited by the desperate property manager. They set up cameras in bathrooms to the chagrin of residents. But it was a camera-shy entity, manifesting only in that corner of one's eye glimpse, that instant before the curtain was drawn back. It was Mira who finally pieced things together. A sleepless night sent her to the building's dusty basement archives, where faded newspapers spoke of tragedy. 30 years earlier, janitor Ellis was found dead in that very boiler room, an apparent drowning. Something about the phrasing of malfunctioning pipe in the article nagged at Mira. She dug deeper, piecing together Ellis's life. He had been a quiet man who worked at Riverview for decades. Residents remembered his kindness, fixing leaks without complaint, coaxing stubborn radiators to life. But in the weeks before his death, Ellis had grown agitated, muttering about something not right in the walls. Mira shared her findings with her neighbors. Much to her surprise, more shadow sightings happened. It no longer merely searched, it seemed to try and communicate. Residents reported waking up to find the faucets running, describing patterns in Morse code. Tiles would shatter in strange ways, revealing glimpses of ancient pipework beneath. As winter plunged deeper, the pipes strained under the weight of ice. One night, a main burst and lower floors flooded. In the general chaos of evacuation, Mira felt inescapably pulled to the boiler room. There, amidst the hiss of steam and rush of water, she finally saw him clearly. Ellis, his form wavering like heat distortion, pointing insistently at a section of wall. Some instinct she couldn't name guided Myra's hands as she began to chip away at the crumbling plaster. Behind it lay a hidden recess, and within, a lockbox. Its contents told a damning tale. Falsified inspection reports, bribes paid to cover up substandard materials. Ellis had discovered the truth, and it had cost him his life. That revelation shook Riverview. With the building under complete renovation, the lives of its residents intertwined in ways they never thought possible. Mrs. Abernathy and the college students formed an unlikely friendship over late-night ghost watches. He, full of guilt for years of neglect, now worked relentlessly for a real community. Hailed as a hero, Mira felt a weight off her shoulders. For years she'd drifted, unsure of her purpose. Now she threw herself into tenant advocacy, vowing to make sure no other building harbored such dangerous secrets. But it didn't end there. As the repairs were nearing their end, one of the workers made the shocking discovery of a small, waterproof capsule hidden inside the pipes. Inside was a letter from Ellis, detailing not just the flaws in the building, but a whole lifetime of regret and lost connections. He wrote about the daughter he had never known, given up for adoption decades ago. The DNA tests proved an impossible surprise in return. Mira was Ellis's granddaughter. Beyond her understanding, she was called by forces beyond her control to Riverview, bringing full circle a tale begun before her birth. The shadow never returned after the renovations, though residents swear that on quiet nights, they still hear the distant sound of whistling echoing through spotless pipes. Ellis, at peace for the first time and looking out over the home he'd tried so hard to protect. I never thought I'd end up living in a place like Oakwood Apartments. It's one of those old buildings that looks like it's seen better days, with peeling paint and creaky floors. But when you're down on your luck, you can't be picky. My name's Jack, and I used to work at the City Museum. I loved my job, showing kids old artifacts and telling them stories about the past. But when the museum had to cut staff, I was the new guy, so I was the first to go. Suddenly, I couldn't afford my nice apartment anymore. That's how I ended up here, in apartment 4B of Oakwood. From the first night, something felt off. I'd wake up feeling like someone was watching me. It wasn't scary, exactly. More like when you feel someone's eyes on you in a crowded room. Sometimes I'd smell smoke, but there was never any fire. I thought maybe the stress of losing my job was getting to me. My first week there, I met some of my neighbors. There was old Mrs. Johnson from 4A, who'd lived in the building for 50 years. She was always baking cookies and leaving them outside people's doors. Then there was Mike from 3B, a college kid who played his music too loud. And Tina from 2C, a nurse who worked night shifts and always looked tired. One day, I was trying to fix a loose floorboard in my bedroom. The landlord, Mr. Dennis, was supposed to do it, but he was always too busy. As I pried up the board, I found something weird underneath. It was a half-burnt photo of a couple. They looked happy, dancing together at some party. On the back it said Thomas and Emma, 1952. I couldn't shake the feeling that this meant something. I showed the photo to Mrs. Johnson. Her eyes got big, and she invited me in for tea. That's when she told me about the fire. It happened in 1953, right in my apartment. A young couple died, trapped inside. Mrs. Johnson was just a little girl then, but she remembered the sirens and the smoke. "That's them," she said, pointing to the photo. "Thomas and Emma. Such a shame. They were so in love." I couldn't stop thinking about Thomas and Emma. Why was their photo hidden under my floor? What happened to them? I started spending my free time at the library, looking through old newspapers. I'm no detective, but I love history. It's like solving puzzles about people who lived long ago. The more I learned, the sadder their story got. Thomas came from a rich family that owned half the town. Emma was a waitress at the local diner. Their families didn't want them together. Thomas's parents even threatened to cut him off if he didn't end things with Emma. But here's where it gets interesting. I found articles about weird things happening around them. Lights would flicker when they were near. Things would move on their own. Some people said Emma had a gift. They said she could sometimes know things before they happened. One article caught my eye. It was about a fire at Thomas's family's factory. The paper said Emma had tried to warn everyone about it the day before, but no one believed her. After that, Thomas and Emma disappeared. Everyone thought they'd run away together. As I dug deeper, I started noticing strange things in my apartment. Sometimes I'd come home and find things moved around. Once, I found an old love letter on my kitchen table. When I tried to pick it up, it vanished. Then came the night that changed everything. I woke up to the sound of music. Old music, like from the 1950s. I thought I was dreaming, but when I opened my eyes, I saw them. Thomas and Emma, dancing in my living room. They looked just like in the photo, but kind of see-through. I should have been scared, but they seemed so happy. They didn't notice me watching. They just kept dancing, lost in their own world. Then, slowly, they faded away. The music stopped, and I was alone again. The next day, I told Mrs. Johnson what I saw. She wasn't surprised. "They've been waiting for someone to see them," she said. "To remember their story." I thought about it. Maybe that's why I found the photo. Maybe that's why I felt drawn to learn about them. They just wanted someone to know their love was real. But there was still something bugging me. How did the fire really start? The old newspapers didn't have much information. That's when I decided to talk to Mr. Dennis, the landlord. His family had owned the building for generations. Mr. Dennis was hesitant at first, but when I showed him the photo, he sighed and invited me into his office. He pulled out an old leather-bound book. It was his grandfather's journal. "My grandfather was the manager here when it happened," Mr. Dennis said. He knew the truth, but was too afraid to tell anyone. According to the journal, Thomas's father had found out where they were hiding. He came to the apartment angry and drunk. There was a fight. A lamp got knocked over, starting the fire. Thomas's father managed to get out, but Thomas and Emma were trapped. The official story was that it was an accident, Mr. Dennis said. My grandfather always felt guilty for not telling the truth. Suddenly, everything made sense. Thomas and Emma weren't just victims of a random fire. They were murdered, in a way. And their story had been buried, just like that photo under my floor. I felt like I had to do something. I couldn't just sit on this information. With Mr. Dennis's permission, I started writing their story. I put up flyers around the neighborhood, asking if anyone remembered Thomas and Emma. Slowly, people started coming forward with old photos, letters, and memories. Tina, the nurse from 2C, surprised me the most. She came to my door one day, looking nervous. I might be related to Emma," she said. "My grandmother had a sister who disappeared in the 1950s. The dates match up." Together, Tina and I pieced together more of the story. We found out that Emma's gift ran in the family. Tina sometimes had dreams that came true, but she'd always been afraid to talk about it. As weeks passed, something changed in the building. The weird feelings stopped. No more smoke smells or feeling watched. It's like Thomas and Emma finally found peace. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear faint music or see shadows dancing. Now it makes me smile. We held a memorial for Thomas and Emma in the building's courtyard. Almost everyone from Oakwood came. We shared the stories we'd collected, and Tina even brought some of her grandmother's old recipes that had been passed down from Emma's family. Mr. Dennis surprised us all by announcing he was renaming the building Thomas and Emma Apartments. He also said he'd be renovating the place, starting with my apartment. "It's time to lay the past to rest," he said, "and make this a home they would have been proud of." I still live here. My job at the museum? They called me back. Turns out my work on Thomas and Emma's story impressed them. They want me to help set up an exhibit about local history. This whole experience taught me something important. Love that's strong doesn't just disappear. It echoes, touching everyone who comes near. And sometimes, the past isn't as far away as we think. It lives on in the stories we tell and the connections we make. Every now and then, I look at that old burnt photo of Thomas and Emma. I think about how their story brought all of us at Oakwood together. How it helped Tina connect with her family history. How it gave Mr. Dennis a chance to right an old wrong. And me? I found more than just a cheap apartment. I found a purpose, a community, and a reminder that every place, every person, has a story worth telling. You just have to be willing to listen.